Okay.
Erika, thank you so much for joining us today. Uh, it's great to see you. I'd love to start with just a quick introduction. Could you tell us about your background and your career path?
Sure. So my degree is in chemical engineering and received that many years ago, and had the good fortune to start my career as a manufacturing engineer, working right on the production line, and did that for a good number of years. And then from there decided to go to technical sales and ended up actually working with some of the same industries that I worked in. So it was a great transition for me and gave me an opportunity to know both sides, so the technical side and also the commercial side. So I worked in technical sales for several years, got some opportunity to do some Lean Six Sigma and did that. And from there moved into supply chain optimization and some leadership. And then from there I started BWiSE. And so we've been in operations for 5 years now. So and not certainly a path that I would have anticipated as an engineer, becoming an entrepreneur, but I think all of that, prepared me for where I am today. So it was great.
That is great. So let's go back to technical sales for a moment. Is
Hmm.
that in the chemical space or was that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I actually sold industrial lubricants. And so if you can think of any rotating equipment that needed gear lube, grease, oil. So transformers, gearbox, motor boxes, wheelbases, anything that needed lubrication. Worked with that and across all industries, because all industries obviously have equipment. So from oil and gas to food manufacturing, agriculture, if it moved, we provided lubrication for it. So it was a great opportunity to see industries that I would have never seen. How would I have seen the agricultural business? I'm a chemical engineer, right? And so it's a great opportunity to kind of diversify my experience. Learned a lot about the business side. That probably was a biggest thing. As engineers, we don't always get a business education while we're in engineering school. It was a great opportunity to see, okay, we've made the product, now we got to sell it. And what are all the things that go on in order for you to be able to sell product on the marketplace?
So today I want to ask you a few questions geared toward
Hmm.
younger engineers, particularly who are graduating this year. So you've had
Right.
a lot of experience in different sectors. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about some of the economic downturns you've seen in your career and how they've
Sure.
impacted those industries.
Sure. So, I guess you consider it lucky or unlucky. I've been able to see quite a few. Most of them have been in oil and gas because that's just the nature of that industry. Um, Oil and gas, unlike I think other industries, are so dependent on things outside of the control of folks in the US. So, if something happens around the world, that may impact, demand for oil and gas or natural gas or other components of energy. And so I've seen, mass layoffs, certainly here in Houston, because when the price of oil drops below a certain level, those engineering projects just are not sustainable, right? They built those models based on a certain price. And if it drops below that price, none of those projects are profitable. So Houston is probably, if you had to experience that, Houston is a place to see it firsthand. I think it certainly would toughen you up, right? If you've ever been through, a layoff where it's industry wide, Houston has had, layoffs in the hundreds of thousands of employees, because it's like a trickle effect. If it hits the majors, the people who own the gas stations, and it trickles down to all the customers or suppliers that support them. So, it's certainly, not a good feeling to experience. Sometimes as folks who are not impacted, you end up with survivor's guilt. So you see your friends getting laid off, and yet you're here. And certainly here in Houston, the salaries for engineers starting out is over $100,000. So you've gone from this high, living very well, you've got a new car, a new apartment, maybe a house, until layoff. So, I would say for younger folks specifically, who are either in oil and gas or in an industry that, faces multiple downturns is stay agile, keep your ear on the ground. Sometimes as engineers, we're so focused on doing that job, right? All the stuff that goes on around us, we're not paying attention. And I used to say, look for the little things, right? Because you're managing Mel Butcher LLC and I'm managing Erika Jefferson LLC, right? So what's important is that I'm able to still generate revenues via a paycheck at this company, if that's the case. And I need to be paying attention, just like companies do, right, of what's going on in the market. So the market is your company. Probably there's not an industry anymore that's not going to be touched by layoffs. But if you work in oil and gas, that's usual. It's every 18 months, oil and gas has a layoff, regardless of what else is going on in the world.
So I haven't worked in oil and gas, but I recognize that there's some volatility there. And you brought up a little bit on personal finances, and I just wanted to mention that for the podcast that I run, Empowering Women, I just had a woman on named Kenyatta Brown who talked about kind of personal finances 101, and she also had some advice about what to do if you lose your job. So that's a great episode. I just wanted to plug really quickly, whether you're a
that sounds great. I'm gonna check that out.
Yeah, Kenyatta has some good insights.
Yeah.
So right now we're seeing an economic downturn because of the pandemic. From where you stand, how is this similar or different from other downturns, in terms of its impact on engineering opportunities?
So because this crosses every industry, right? There's not an industry that hasn't been impacted by COVID. Typically oil and gas, like I said, is due to world events beyond our control. So if OPEC decides to increase production, which is oil producing companies, I use acronyms because I'm so used to them, but things around the world could happen that obviously would impact the price of oil, and thus resulting in projects getting canceled, companies, cutting back in order to save cost. And, that, like I said, that happens every 18 months. So you kind of get used to it. And that's why you see a lot of folks, they've got 5 years here, 5 years there, and 5 years there. That's because there've been layoffs, in between those time periods. And, if you're well networked, which hopefully we'll talk about that in a bit, but if you're well networked, you'll just bounce back, right? You'll just show up here and then you show up there, you show up there. This time, however, not only is it a worldwide phenomena, but the things that would allow it to correct are not in place, right? So summer driving season, it's almost June. So we will be, good way into summer driving season, getting ready for the 4th of July, which I think is peak summer driving. So because we're all in the house and just starting, to come out, they've missed a whole month, so that production has had to be cut also because it's very difficult. Anybody who knows oil and gas knows that you never shut down a refinery. Like if you shut down a refinery, that could be millions of dollars just to restart. And so they've had to cut rates, but they're still producing product. So where do you put all that product that nobody is buying, right? So it's just not a matter of, things are down and, they'll be back. Nobody knows when things are going to come back. So you can't anticipate what the demand will be, right? So this one, it's kind of like a black swan. If you've ever read this book talking about black swan events, that I don't think anyone could have predicted the impact globally. And, typically, industries have a couple verticals that they support. So if one industry goes down, then you're just going to have to shift your focus, to another vertical. So if you focus on oil and gas, but you also cover healthcare and food or technology, then you just shift your focus there. But everything's down. So, for young engineers, there really isn't even a place to hide, right? Especially if you're the traditional, civil, mechanical, electrical, chemical. So that's why you got to be agile. You got to keep your eyes open. I'm looking at the stock market. I personally think all young engineers should have a subscription to Wall Street Journal, just so you get used to seeing business news on a regular basis. So you're watching these things. Oh, I saw our competitor file for bankruptcy. Wonder if that means for us. Watching these things. So it's not, so you don't miss anything, basically. And then, when you experience a downturn, which is, certainly not within your control, you're a little ahead. You just need to always say, you don't have to be the fastest or the best. You need to be better than the slowest person. That's all you need to do. You just need to be faster than the slowest person. So being ahead of that curve. So, when they're looking at, um, rifts or layoffs or whatever they call them, that you're already ahead, you're already thinking that way. Maybe you won't be impacted. Maybe you're going to be one of the fortunate ones, but you're prepared. You're not caught off guard. So that would be I think this is the new normal, is we're going to have, cyclical periods in our economy, and we've just got to be able to respond, quickly and get back up.
So this is a particularly difficult time for everyone, but
Mhm.
I think people who are graduating this year are feeling an extra amount of pressure, because with
Exactly.
layoffs happening, there's kind of a flood of talent available in the market. And so if you don't
Exactly.
have experience, how do you compete? So what would your advice be to young engineers, young scientists who are coming out of school this year?
I would say you've got to be cross discipline. So, I took one programming class when I was in engineering school, and they don't even use that anymore. So it's not even really applicable. But now I'm seeing certainly chemical engineers, are doing data science, and civil engineers are doing, programming in Python. So I feel like even if your school does not offer that in their curriculum, that you can find a way to add to your skill set. But if you are a civil engineer and you've got to know about material science, because you have to understand what goes into the concrete mix when you're building buildings and things like that, or you're an electrical engineer, but gosh, I really need to understand about refinery operations because I'm an electrical engineer in a refinery. But I would say for areas that are not explicitly technology driven, get some technology, take a coding class. I don't know if that's mandatory, but it should be. Take some coding as a biologist. I mean, that's kind of coming up. I feel like I was ahead of uh, my period, because now they've got computational biology, and that's an incredible amount of computer knowledge and background that you need. But outside of that, the regular ones, civils don't necessarily need computer training, because you're going to have softwares that your company is going to provide for you, and you're not doing the background software, you're using it, right? It's already been developed. But what if you also knew the background of it, right? So if something went wrong, you could say, hey, I'm a civil, but I also know about codings, and I know this isn't right. So I would say, certainly for those of us on the traditional science and engineering side, get some coding, because I promise you, they'll hire a civil engineer who has coding background to work on bridges, but they will never hire a computer science person who's got no science or engineering background to work on that, right? They're kind of limited on working on the computer part.
So when we look ahead for a sector like oil and gas, is there
Mhm.
anything that you would recommend young people to focus on or build up as they're like moving forward and progressing in their career?
Yes, yes. You've got to, and I wish I had, thought about this. You've got to get that experience and knowledge about managing large amounts of data. Like I've heard people say data is the new oil, and it really is, because every company, every industry is reliant on data. Sometimes they don't even know how to use it, right? They just like, I got a lot of data, so I got to hire this PhD data scientist. That is so critical. Programming is wonderful, that's good, but that's a means to an end. We were getting oil out of the ground before computers. And if the computers shut down, we can still get oil out the ground. That just makes it easier. And obviously, if things are easier, we can, increase the cost and decrease the cost and increase the revenue, or the sales price. So for those of us who, took the minimum computer science, to graduate, I would encourage, go back, definitely add some programming languages, but even consider additional studies in data science in particular, because that's kind of the fundamental thing of everything. Everything needs data science. But I think to your point, it's so critical that you have domain experience, people with domain experience, because I would be overwhelmed if I were to go into a chemical plant or a refinery and somebody says, look at all these variables. Now, which of these variables are going to cause our production to decrease? And I've got, a bachelor's in math, a master's in statistics, and a PhD in data science, and I've never set foot in a refinery. Like, my head is going to explode. So what typically happens, people either, they look at everything, and sometimes you could get misled by the data, and you think something is something, but there may be a clear reason. I'll tell you experience. Frequently, we leave the roll-up doors on the manufacturing plant up. It's hot. We were in the South. So if you base your temperature on the ambient area, if I close that roll-up door down, then that's going to change. And so you'd have to know that. You'd have to know things like that.
So when we think about these young engineering and science candidates, they've got good credentials. What else do they need? And what do you coach women, say in BWiSE, to also focus on besides those technical credentials?
Yes. The two big ones. If you do these things, you'll have a long career, but if you don't, you're probably going to struggle. So the first one is network, right? So who you know and who knows you are very important. So a lot of times we're content with, oh, I'm only going to, associate with the engineers, or if there's a project outside of engineering, I don't want to do it because it's soft. I want to focus on the hard stuff. And so you don't build your network. And that's especially true when it comes to layoffs. The folks who are matrix, they could be the world's worst engineer. They couldn't calculate something if their life depended on it, but they know everybody. Hi, Betty. Hi, Mark. Everybody knows them, right? Everybody knows they're not that strong of an engineer, but they're like, but everybody knows that person and everybody likes them. More importantly, everybody likes them, right? So that's number one, is make sure you're networked, not just in your internal organization, but externally in the industry. I can't tell you how many people have said that, yeah, I was, about to get laid off, or I didn't like my job, and somebody I met at a trade show called me. Perfect timing, right? Didn't even miss a paycheck. So that's number one. The second is executive presence. And I've spoken about this in particular at the FDA, which is almost all scientists, like even the people in the finance department are scientists. And I said, listen, when you're in school, especially depending on where you went to school, just as long as you're relatively clean, right? That's all you really needed. But after graduation, you've got to be polished. People make judgments on you before you even open your mouth. So, for engineers that we may not, value aesthetics as much. And so you're like, it's reasonably clean and, it's kind of pressed. That is your brand. People are making judgments. And keep in mind, as engineers, we get all this technical knowledge, but then we end up working for people who are in marketing, right? It's the people who are marketing who are at the frat party all night who end up being the vice presidents of your division. And so that's important to folks, is how you present. And I see a lot of women, but men too. And I'm like, you are a brilliant engineer. But when people see you, they don't see that, right? So executive presence, which is not just your clothes, but it's how you carry yourself. Engineers are not necessarily the most gregarious folks. A lot of us are introverts. And so I see a lot of looking down, right? You're in meetings and you're looking down, or people look at you and you kind of look like, please don't call me, please don't ask me anything. But being able to convey confidence in what you do, that is important. And I wish schools, spend a little bit more time developing that.
I love that advice. Erika, thank you so much for joining me today to go through these questions. I know this is going to be really helpful for all of our viewers.
Yes, I'm glad. It's so important. I want to say a last piece is those of us who have been successful, or maybe not successful, you can tell them what not to do. It's so important that we reach back and share what we've learned, what worked, what didn't work, what I wish I had done, what I wish I hadn't done, is so important. You know, we cannot just, because that's what happened to us. We didn't really, my generation didn't really have a lot of, you know, people to ask advice for. We're just like, oh, you want to be an engineer? Good for you. So I think there's
Good luck.
enough of, good luck. Hope that works out. I think there's enough of us that we can share, especially for women. That's so critical that we share, right? There's no competition. Your only competition is yourself.